I call Eugenie Sage.
Well, I think, Mr Speaker, this bill is certainly an exercise in pork barrel politics and trying to get votes for the National Party's candidate on the West Coast. But I wish it was just a cheap political stunt. It's much more than that because it has very serious consequences for our conservation legislation. And even in Clause 10 of the bill, the very different test that this is imposing on the Director-General of Conservation for how he's going to evaluate these applications to log on conservation land. He's required to look at the effects of the logging and whether or not they're contrary to the purpose of the Resource Management Act. And as David Clendon noted, that purpose is one of sustainable management. It's quite a different purpose from the purpose of the Conservation Act, which is about the preservation and protection of our natural resources. So this bill is a fundamental weakening of the Conservation Act, and both in allowing logging and the criteria which the Director-General must use in evaluating logging. So, Mr Speaker, Cyclone Ita was certainly a tragedy for West Coast residents who had the roofs blown off their homes or their businesses suffered damage because of the cyclonic winds, but it was never a tragedy for our forests. Native forests in New Zealand are dynamic. They are used to periodic disturbances, whether it's from big heavy snow events or big wind events. That part of disturbance is part of the endless cycle of death, decay and regeneration of these forests. Where you get areas of wind blow, you get more light, you get that encouraging the seedlings to regrow, and you get the recycling of nutrients. And as the distinguished botanist Sir Alan Mark said in a letter in today's Dominion, and he's someone who has spent decades studying West Coast forests, and I quote Sir Alan, "Preserving and understanding natural processes, no matter how destructive, is a key reason why we have preserved these forests." So the timber is not wasted by being windthrow, and by disturbing the forest to log the timber, we are attacking the very reason why these areas are protected. So it's deeply saddening to be part of a parliament where the government and its supporting parties is prepared to pass legislation which overturns that consensus that we not have logging on conservation land. And as the regulatory impact statement makes very clear, and I quote, "The current legislation governing protected areas was specifically designed to prevent the harvest of Indigenous timber from these lands." And that was because the department was set up as an agency which was charged with managing these forests for conservation, for recreation, allowing tourism where that didn't have impacts on conservation values, but prohibiting the harvest of timber in virtually all circumstances except for customary purposes and some existing licences. So it's that legislation, that commitment to not logging conservation land, which has protected our reserves, protected our conservation parks, and that's what this bill is overturning. Mr Speaker, the Green Party is opposing this West Coast windblown timber conservation lands bill because we stand for protecting our natural heritage, protecting our native species, which help give us our identity and which are so special because many of them are found nowhere else in the world, which means we have an international responsibility to protect them and their habitats. So logging is totally contrary to that. It's contrary to the protection and preservation purpose of the Conservation Act, and it's part of a very short-sighted economic policy which is focused on extracting the maximum dollar value from a tax or from exploitation of nature. And the Green Party wants a healthy environment. We think resource use has to be sustainable, and this bill is not promoting that because it's winding back the protection of West Coast forests, which people throughout New Zealand thought they had achieved in 1999 when the logging chainsaws were finally stopped and the 100,000 hectares of forest that Timberlands was proposing for its West Coast beach scheme was stopped. So what the government's doing is going back to the future. It's restarting an unsustainable industry by allowing the logging companies to access conservation land. It's been really disappointing that the Minister has declined to consider seriously any of the SOPs which opposition parties put to try and mitigate some of those impacts, to protect the forests from weeds, to prevent the damage that ground-based extraction would cause, to restrict it to helicopter logging. But it's really disappointing that all of these changes to the public conservation estate and to our protected lands are going through under urgency with absolutely no opportunity for the public to have any involvement in this overturning of the fundamental protection provisions of the Conservation Act.
I call Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a short final call on this bill. Mr Speaker, I'm disappointed